the floor is now open for comments. I see Lazzi, okay? And Antoinette, put your thing upright, that's easier.
I have a comment and a question to Alex and Hans-Peter. Is that this continuous difference between the Northwest and the two peripheries of Europe might be simply just linked to one being basically the rule makers, or the countries of the rule makers of Europe, and others are the rule takers. That is, until basically 2004, the key questions of economic development were decided outside of Eastern and Central Europe, and then it just continued with much, of course, lesser speed after that. Whereas in the South, the rule taker situation became clear after 2008, after the crisis. So that might be one of the reasons. That's why I asked the question. Did you have, is there any kind of question in these surveys on satisfaction with EU and EU democracy, and satisfaction in any aspects of EU? Because I would expect then very different results. And to Anna, I have just a minor thing that what you find brings a bell to me, that basically the domestic demand side for different institutional, the stabilization of the different institutions might vary a lot. That is, whereas in the economy, the domestic demand side is very much shaped by the transnationalized economy with very robust players that can go, they have the means to make sure that their interest in trade or in internal market are honored. The other is basically the citizens whose capacities didn't really increase.
Antoinette, we're going to go around counterclockwise. Antoinette.
Thank you. I have a question and a comment to Anna. And my question is the following. If you are saying that you reach the conclusions that parties do not distinguish themselves very well, which I fully agree, in Eastern Europe, and this is even more so after accession, could you reflect on how this relates to the set of arguments that we see in the Western European, the European Union literature, that this is because the European Union's level of regulation does not leave policy space for party competition? So Ivan Krestev and others have made this argument very prominently. In which case it would not be an Eastern European problem, but it would be a general EU problem. I think that's very important. And my comment is, I very much agree with the perspective that you're taking, and that this is where we should look for the body, but where the corpse is hidden in terms of the problems of. But you're saying that essentially the EU is sort of irrelevant, and in my. At the level of party competition, party programs maybe, but when I look at different sectoral policy processes, what I see, part one is exactly the same what you're saying. Institutions are dismantled only where they prevent state capture or competition for rents or whatever you call it. But what I also see is that in other areas where the EU has already brought in some of its regulatory framework, it enables other actors who try to stop this process. Especially I've seen this in a recent sort of in-depth case study of the environmental process, where some actors try to actively stop this process by making an alliance with the EU. So maybe you could also comment on the sectoral differences.
Frank.
Yeah, thank you. I also have a question for Anna. I mean, the basic message of your talk was, well, a couple of things are going wrong, but it's not the EU's fault, or it's not an EU effect.
Sure, the mustache.
I mean, in a way, I think one could draw the opposite conclusion if one distinguishes between, let's say, an EU effect and the EU's fault. I mean, you basically said, okay, it's not the EU's fault, it's basically domestic politics. But I think it is a vast EU effect that changed in the post-accession period in terms of, let's say, the absence of EU influence on the politics and the institutional developments of these countries. I mean, much of what you showed is, well, in the accession period, the EU basically act as a constraint on some of the populism or anti-democratic policies that now come back again to the surface. It also acted in favor of institutional changes that are now being dismantled where they hurt the political elites. So I think what one could also say, well, what happens now to a large extent can happen, yeah, because of the absence of EU decisive influence after the accession conditionality is over.
Moshmir.
Well, I will also continue on the conditionality, and it goes also back a little bit to Antonietta. So it's really, to a certain extent, common, but also, of course, question. I was part of these accession negotiations in Slovenia, and you know, we were the first one having this explicit kind of Kiebenhavn criteria. But it was very interesting to see those negotiations in terms of the conditionality, which is here discussed. More or less, we all met before starting the negotiations that economic criteria about talking about the RU market economy. Right? Please, I would be very nice to hear what is the definition of this. I never were really able to get either from the Commission where these assessments were done, and even more so, the second economic criteria to become the country able to be competitive. I would say that this conditionality, at least from the point of view when negotiations started, they were really more or less focused on the acquis issues. The political criteria there, at least for this group of countries, was, I would say, much less as a problematic issue than it is for this Balkan group of countries. Also, if you see the negotiations, the way how the negotiations are being done, I remember this political criteria, those chapters which were dealt with the political issues, they were not really considered very important. I'm not saying they were not important, but they were also, if you look when they were opened quite late in the negotiations and closed very quickly. Now you have a different situation. They are opened first and they close the last. So there is a very different way of the conditionality is being applied. Also on this acquis part of the conditionality, I think there is a substantial change. In our times, and I'm talking here in the times of all these 10, I think really the major focus of the attention was a harmonization issue. I'm not saying that the implementation was not on the table, but I think it's today much, much more clearly and much more deeply looked at before a country is given then those dates for completing the negotiations.
That's all right. Any remarks from the panel? If not, we can go back to questions.
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, Laszlo. Yes, we have measures of attitudes towards the EU in the ESS. There are several of them: trust in institutions, etc., etc., and in the European Parliament, European Commission, etc. So we simply did not put them into the model right now. What we wanted to do in the multivariate analysis is to do the exact same thing that Anderson and Guillory did. So we estimated a model that was specified in the exact same way, with the same variables as close as possible than Anderson and Guillory, to just test for this basic hypothesis. Now we can add other factors, and we will add other factors into it, and I think this is a good suggestion. I don't think it will fundamentally change the results, but we'll see.
Actually, the strengthening
Yes.
for the same argument.
Yes.
Yeah.
if I could answer the questions. Thank you very much for these. I mean, those are very good comments. So, it's not that I'm arguing that the EU is either irrelevant or there's no EU effect, but or that it's, it stops being a constraint. I think instead there's a spectrum, right? Where some of the institutions that the EU created basically wind up being very durable and gain resilience over time. And other institutions that the EU has created lose that, basically become more fragile over time. And the big difference seems to be that those institutions that create the new constituencies for basically the perpetuation of the institutions, or ones that create new economic relationships, so the kind that Laszlo describes, that basically complicate and create more veto players and complicate the undoing of any of this by political fiat, gain resilience over time. But others that have either very diffuse constituencies or no constituencies at all, like anti-corruption agencies, right, where nobody wants corruption, but are we all willing to go to the barricades for the agency? No, we're not. Those are the kinds of institutions that are basically the easiest to pick apart, and those are the ones that become more fragile over time, or more to the point, more dependent on incumbents. So I think there's a spectrum there, and some institutions basically lose resilience over time much more readily.
One is concerning Anna is correct to say that there are lots of overlap and vagueness in party stances, especially on economic issues. But on the other hand, if you look at Eastern European party system, there is a huge competitive dimension, which is sociocultural one, and parties really distinguish themselves clearly on those. And finally, and the second remark is that we tend to think about this accession period as if it was only the Eastern Europeans who were so desperate to get into the Western world. But at the same time, let me remind you that I still remember the 2004 negotiations, at least between our Prime Minister and Schroeder. To the last very moment, it was a Western blueprint. The Westerners were equally desperate to have a success in the enlargement. So let's not forget that, this was not as one-sided phenomenon and process as we tend to think. I really remember those hours in which the negotiations were there. And apparently Schroeder didn't want to have its eastern neighbor, a relatively big country, to be out of this business. And he was desperate to do anything to have us in, although it was a political decision at the time, more than economic, of course.
Yes, I forgot reacting to something that Marek said in his talk, basically about how logical it is what we find, that we find what we find with our public opinion data. I'm always a bit hesitant when it comes to obvious, logical, etc. Ever since Laszlo Sveld's work on the American soldier, where there's a fantastic passage in there of what is obvious, and then in the end turns out not to be obvious at all. One could have thought that maybe in Eastern Europe and Central Europe it is particularly well evaluated democracy, because it's a little bit of democracy, such a big leap forward from your nostalgia that you expressed before, that it could actually be, topping the values that we find in Western Europe. Well, it wasn't the case, and I think it is necessary to show it.
Andrew and Milada and Andras, and I don't know if I see any more. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, this is to Alexander and Hans-Peter. I wondered if you could flesh out a little more what you see as driving the liberal democratic side of this. So if I understand the results correctly, and Radoslav's results are like this too. So the liberal democratic side seems to me the most important to people. It's where they're most positive, and that dovetails with results that, with other measures, that people trust political institutions most when they're liberal democratic institutions, and trust parliaments and elected politicians less. But then when you go to analyze what causes changes in these things, you focus much more on direct democracy and Carol Pateman and all that kind of stuff. But I'm curious what drives people's perceptions of the democratic institutions that they care about most and have generated the most positive views about. And it seems to me a particularly important question because the EU and European processes in general specialize in interacting with those kinds of institutions. So insofar as what we're discussing is the EU and its interaction with countries, and not least things like asylum and courts and whatnot, this is really the issue that matters. So I'm wondering what you learned from this data about what drives people's perceptions about liberal democratic efficacy.
Yes.
I have a question also to Alexander and Hans Peter, because I understand, of course, that your analysis is based mostly on data collected in a long time span, European elections, it's only a moment. But I would like to ask you how you explain, on the one hand, this high level of satisfaction of model of liberal democracy in the northwest countries in Europe, and this potential of anti-establishment parties in these countries during these elections. How to explain this with this high level of satisfaction? It is only a momentum, or maybe it forced to analyze the satisfaction as a much more complex problem. And on the other hand, if you take, for example, the societies in the South European countries, where you indicate this expectations vis-à-vis the social aspects of democracy, then with, I think only with exception of Greece, you cannot find in these elections any proof for any driving political forces in this direction. You cannot find it in Spain or Portugal or even in Italy. So how to put together your long tendencies in your analysis with this momentum we had now during these elections?
Milada.
Thank you. I have a comment for Radoslav and a question for Anna. So Radoslav, I think you're absolutely right that studying the legacies, the positive legacies of real socialism is one way forward, especially from a comparative perspective if you compare to Latin America or other parts of the world. But it's not just a skilled workforce and education and low levels of inequality, urbanization and collectivization. These were all incredibly positive from the perspective of modernization, but also the collapse of the Soviet market, right? Because this forced an incredibly rapid reorientation of trade from east to west. And I was just looking at those numbers. It's amazing. Between 1990 and 1993, something like 70% of trade that had been going to the east was now going to the west. So it's really fascinating to look at those 89 to 93 or 92 and see how much changed. And I think you're really right about that. For Anna, you know, one of the things which people forget, I think, is that the EU didn't really have an anti-corruption agenda in the first enlargement, right? So for the 2004 candidates, corruption was not on the table. In fact, when my brief period of working for President Havel in the Czech Republic, that was like my job to try to get anti-corruption into the regular report. And we all know what happened: Greece, Portugal, Spain, France. The member states blocked it, right? So in a sense, what happened is that only in 2007 with Bulgaria and Romania did corruption kind of become a goal of conditionality, so fighting corruption. And one of the ironies, I think, of your paper, and this is my question, is to what extent do the populist parties that you're looking at themselves actually gain a portion of their vote from a kind of simple anti-corruption platform which doesn't really have any substance to it, but they're sort of saying vote for us because we're less corrupt than the other guys, and then a bunch of other stuff as well. And so you have a kind of ironic where a system which is really about competing over rents and rent seeking is actually furthered by electoral campaigns that are fought on kind of very shallow anti-corruption campaigns.
So just really briefly, these legacies, because I will be a little more cautious with legacies. Of course, they matter, but what really matters is what the politicians make out of it. So this is what I learned actually from the book of Doro and Bela, that just to mention, you mentioned this Polish agriculture, 2% or 27% of labor force produces 2% of GDP in Hungary. 5% of arable lands was used by small peasants to produce more than 50% of the export, agricultural export before the regime change. So you would expect that now Hungarians are much better off than the Poles. Wrong. Exactly the opposite is the case. The Hungarians destroyed the agriculture. The Poles created something that works.
Just one sentence. And that is a puzzle I have, that we can even talk about positive legacies of communism. Like if we talked about positive legacies of Nazism, and may I point out that there was higher educated workforce and all that, we would be appalled, as we should be. So I struggle with accepting the very proposition that there were positive legacies of communism. These societies valued education, but we know that that precedes the rise of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. They valued some basic democratic, well, they treasured some basic democratic values, but again, that precedes the rise of communism. So it is in defiance of communist legacies that they succeeded in rebuilding them. And I mean, Putin manages to restore the credibility of Stalin. I don't think we should engage in restoring the credibility of communist legacies.
That the Third Reich lasted 12 years and communism lasted a slightly longer time, therefore that might make some difference. Andras.
Shown or indicated by the data that there was an increase of populism after accession. Don't you think that this can partly be explained by the fact that while during the pre-accession period and also in the framework of negotiations, all negotiating Central Eastern European countries had a more or less clear strategy, a pre-accession strategy. And at once the accession treaties were signed, everybody leaned back, congratulated themselves, and told, we have done all the job, now we don't have to do anything because we are full-fledged members. That was just the moment where a post-accession strategy should have been elaborated and implemented by all member countries. Nobody did it, including institution building, including public opinion building, including education, etc., etc. So this is, in my view, one of the major failures we have all made after accession, and that might be a lesson for those who would like to join in the future. The second is, I fully agree that social cohesion is a critical minimum of social cohesion is absolutely important everywhere in Europe. Although what is critical minimum is different from country to country because the social and political tolerance of the individual society is different. But I would like to remind of this ongoing discussion with the publication of the book of Piketty and his theories on polarization, which has a number of reasons. But one thing we are all facing today is it's a different kind of polarization. It is not a polarization of income. It is a polarization of wealth which had been accumulated due to 3 generations without war in Europe. And those who have inherited without any personal work 3 houses, and they can rent the houses, they will be in a much more advantageous position than somebody who does not have it, but only has to say a 5,000 euro, not very bad salary. So income polarization is one issue, but wealth polarization is much more dangerous. And how to avoid, how to stop it, how to control it is another question. The third issue for one of the, I think the biggest challenges for the democracy and democratic institutions in Europe, all over the continent, is the rapidly growing gap between political and economic rationality. Political rationality in a democracy means 4 years. You are in power, you would like to keep your power. Those who are in opposition would like to come to power. But most of the economic challenges we are facing, from demography to healthcare, from education to competitiveness, from migration to social justice, they can be, I would not say settled, they can be somehow remedied, or only in a period which is much longer than a 4-year political cycle. How can we reconcile the 4-year political rationality with an 8, 10, or 15 years of economic rationality? It is a real challenge to democracy in Europe. And the last point, I think that this backlash, I would like to call it really as a backlash in some countries of democracy, of democratic institutions. It has again, can be explained partly by two different time frames. One is the 25 years of transformation. Macro-political transformation is relatively easy. Macroeconomic stabilization is easy, you have to bear the social cost. Microeconomic transformation needs about 10 to 15 years, but the social transformation, the mental transformation, it needs probably 1 generation. And now this backlash, this mental backlash is coming back, and it is reinforced by the other mental backlash produced by the global crisis, where financial and economic problems could be more or less settled. The social consequences and the mental consequences are just now with us, and they are very strong in many European countries, as the European parliamentary elections showed. In the new member countries, the transformation and the mental backlash of transformation and the mental backlash of the economic crisis are reinforcing each other.
Thank you very much. I will just, as the chair, introduce very briefly 2 points. First, from Hans-Peter and Alexandre's presentation, you would believe that Northern Europe has reached the end of history. That is to say, everybody on your data seems to be satisfied. How in the hell do you explain then the results of the last European elections when several of those countries produced rather dramatic changes? So they weren't quite as satisfied, perhaps, as your data suggested. Secondly, I fail to understand the core of the argument, of Anna's argument. Contestation over state institutions and resources versus contestation over constituencies. I thought politicians, what's wrong about politicians contesting over state institutions and resources? I kind of thought that's what they did. So I'm not clear, because you clearly imply that it's a very bad thing to contest state institutions and resources, and somehow it's a good thing to contest. I want to maybe sharpen that distinction, and so I understand it better, because I didn't find anything particularly surprising about contesting state resources. That's what I thought politicians do. But, okay.
Okay, I start with Andrew's question about what is driving the liberal democracy side. And I must say that we are at the beginning of our data analysis, and I must say that it is extremely complicated, the relationships implied. I mean, Alex already said that what seems obvious is maybe not so obvious. And I want to give you just an idea of the complication. Now, I showed you that expectations are lower where liberal democracy is working better. That's an aggregate level result. That's I mean, we compared countries. So in the and I also said, to begin with, the driver is the experience of what people have with how democracy works in their country. So the explanation is to be sought very close to politics. What they experience with politics explains the opinions they have about politics. So on the aggregate, in countries where liberal democracy functions well, people seem to demand and expect less from liberal democracy. Now, let's go into a specific country. In a country like a northwestern European country, like a Scandinavian country where liberal democracy functions well. In such a country, at the individual level, the relationship between expectations and evaluations is positive. That is, in Scandinavia, those who evaluate positively democracy expect more from democracy. So at the country level, it's actually this idea of rising expectations, or maybe formulated differently in such countries, those who are dissatisfied with how democracy works, don't expect very much, are cynical about the democratic process, and these guys are then a potential for right-wing populists. So there is no contradiction between what I said and the outcome of the European election in Denmark or in Norway or whatever. About the European elections in Southern Europe, what we saw is contrary to what the question formulated. We saw very massive reactions, electoral reactions to the predicament of Southern European countries. Spain, the mainstream parties, the two mainstream parties lost 30% of their vote. That's massive. I mean, they went down from 80% to barely 50%. The parties who gained are not right-wing populists because we don't have them in Spain. They are regional, they are left-wing populists, and they are assorted, fragmented, smaller parties. In Italy, I mean, it was the destruction of the traditional right, if you want. Berlusconi is down to 17%, and he was somewhere in the region of 40% before. And you have Beppe Grillo, who does 21%. So you have a protest party which does tremendously, spectacularly. Portugal is an exception, I would concede. There are other exceptions around, but generally the trend in dissatisfaction you saw in Southern Europe has had massive electoral consequences. I would like to say also something about the idea of populism in Eastern Europe. I see it a bit like Anna sees it. In Eastern Europe, populism is much more widespread than in Western Europe, but it has another characteristic. It's not the right-wing, not mainly the right. There are also this Polish KPN, which was mentioned, but also there was Ataka once upon a time. There is Jobbik in Hungary, so there is right-wing populism. But overall, like Peter Uchen, a Slovak scholar, has called it, it's a centrist populism. It's pure populism. They have only anti-elitism as program and nothing else. So it's anti-elitism, which has something to do what Anna described as this elite contestation and self-serving attitudes of the elites.
Can I just add very briefly to the question of Andy? What is driving the evaluations of liberal democracy? And we're at the beginning, I said also to Laszlo, and Hans-Peter said it now, it's very complex to see. We started off with a very simple idea, is that what Anderson and Guillory said is democracy is about winning or losing elections, and we wanted to check whether that is also the case in Europe, and whether regional differences make a difference, and they do very massively. The electoral consequences of being in the winner's side, on the winner's side or on the loser's side, have a tremendous effect on how you view liberal democracy in Eastern and in Southern Europe. When you lose, when you're in the opposition, you don't blame the political outcome of the election, you blame the way the election went, basically. You blame the system for not having produced fair and free elections, etc., with all the rest of the attributes that you need for a fair and free election. And that is absolutely not the case in Northern and Western Europe, where this difference just doesn't matter at all. And we think that is an important first finding.
So, Milad, on this idea of anti-corruption and when it was emphasized, you're absolutely right. In 2004, the EU emphasized reforming the state and administrative capacity. In 2007, it was about anti-corruption, which is why in Romania and Bulgaria, those are the agencies that get dismantled in 2009. Right? By 2009, they're gone. So I fully take that on board, but I don't think it really changes the story. As for to what extent did populists gain from sort of these anti-corruption measures and what was going on, they gained a lot, right? Because what happens, especially combined with the volatility, each new wave of populists can claim, look, we're untainted by participation in the system. We are anti-elitist. We are anti the guys who are doing this to you. And so, of course, they gain as sort of, an increasingly frustrated electorate sort of tries out another populist option. And for Philippe, this idea of what's the big deal? Of course that political parties always compete over resources, but what political parties do in established democracies is compete over the distribution of resources via state channels and delivering them to constituencies broadly defined.
Challenging the institutions themselves.
What I'm saying is that they're competing not about redistribution; they're competing about the rules of the game. Which is why you see electoral gerrymandering take place. There's sort of remaking of electoral institutions, remaking of the constitutional courts, the redoing of state administration, in many places.
Okay, just I think generally what we need is some discipline in talking about populism, xenophobia, Euroscepticism. A lot has been mixed here, and when I look at all these parties, which we tend to lump into one basket, it's definitely they differ very much. And also the second point is about absolute numbers. This Polish KPN, 7% support. Yeah, in a 22% turnout, so it means 1.4% of the eligible vote. I mean, don't make it, too much of it. It's 420,000 people in a 31 million electorate. So yeah, there are these people that they have justified criticism of what is going on, but that's only as big as 1.5%. That's it. And then on this, let me first remind you that I was talking about the legacies of real socialism, not communism. Had I had time, I would have spent the rest of the day listing all the malpractices of communism. I'm aware of those. I know everything about what was wrong with communism. The only thing I'm making, and I am in an academia, I think all questions are justified if there is a chance that they explain something. That is the... And the final thing is that, and we started it with Herbert Kitchell in our 1999 book, communisms differ. There were very different types of communism, especially in the 70s and in the 80s. I was brought up in a communism in which I had a passport in my pocket. I did read Schmitter at the time, and I had all access. I wouldn't call it, according to Linz and Stepan, a totalitarian regime. I know, I have read it, that in the 50s there was a nasty Stalinist regime, but in the 70s and 80s, I didn't experience it. I'm objecting to putting everything into one basket, plus this after comma that there was Nazism. It doesn't help, I think, talk about serious causes of certain events and phenomena. That's my point about it. Thank you.
On that note, I thank the panelists and invite you all to lunch. I don't know where it is. Are we going to...